My name is Anna, and I'm 29 years old. My life has been a turbulent ride from the very beginning, and for most of it, I never quite understood why I felt so out of place. Growing up, I never felt like I was truly part of a family. Not the kind that loved me unconditionally, not the kind that made me feel safe or valued. No, my family always seemed like something I was merely a part of, a distant observer in a world where I was constantly overlooked and pushed aside. And it all started when I was just a child. When I was 4 years old, my mother remarried. I wasn't entirely sure how it happened, but suddenly, my life was thrown into disarray. Her new husband, Mark, came with his son, Chris, who was 13 years older than me. I didn't know it at the time, but that marriage would forever change the course of my life. Chris wasn't just a regular stepbrother to me. He was the son my mother had always wanted. From the moment she married Mark, I was no longer her focus. She had a new golden child to shower her attention on, and it wasn't me. I don't even remember my father much. He died when I was young, and I was raised mostly by my mother. But when she remarried, I could see how things changed. Chris was already an adult by the time I came into the picture, and he was nothing short of resentful. Resentful of my presence, resentful of the attention I got when I was around, and resentful of the fact that he was no longer the only child. I can't say it was outright hatred, but I could always tell that I wasn't welcome. Chris wasn't one for normal sibling rivalry. No, his treatment of me was far more cruel and calculating. He'd lock me in dark places, like the guest bathroom or the shed out back, just for his amusement. He'd steal my lunchbox and make sure I went hungry on days he was supposed to drop me off at school. I remember times when I'd sit at my desk, trying to focus on my work, while Chris taunted me from the doorway. "What's wrong with you, Anna? Don't you want to be part of the family?" he would ask, his eyes full of disdain. I was so young, so helpless. But what made it worse was that no one believed me. My mother would always laugh it off, saying things like, "Oh, come on, Anna. Chris is just teasing you. You should be tougher than that." And that's how it always went. I couldn't tell anyone what was going on because no one would listen. It wasn't just the bullying. It was the complete emotional neglect that crushed me day after day. Chris's cruelty didn't stop at emotional manipulation. As I got older, it got worse, much worse. He began to invade my privacy, walking in on me while I was in the bathroom or showering. He stole my underwear, and I knew it was him because I'd find them in his room. I told my mom, of course, but she always dismissed it. "Boys will be boys," she'd say. She never took it seriously, just brushed it aside as if it was something normal. But it wasn't normal, not at all. By the time I was 14, it was clear to me that I was nothing but a nuisance to my mother. I wasn't her precious child anymore. I was just someone who had to deal with Chris's whims and still somehow try to fit in. It didn't matter how often I cried or how much I tried to talk to her. Every time I did, I was told to be strong, to just deal with it. Chris was her son, and I was just the one who was getting in the way of their perfect little family. I began to retreat. I didn't speak to anyone. I kept my head down, did what I had to do, and stayed out of Chris's way as much as I could. But things didn't get any better. As I entered my teenage years, Chris's behavior became even more disturbing. The taunts, the invasion of my privacy, the psychological torment, it all piled on, making me feel more isolated with each passing day. But what hurt the most was the fact that my mother never stood up for me. She just let it all happen, as if I were the problem, as if I was the one who needed to be fixed. When I was 16, things reached a breaking point. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. Chris entered my room while I was sleeping, and he did something. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes told me everything. I screamed, but no one came. I begged my mom for help, but she just called me dramatic and said that I was overreacting. Chris, of course, was never punished. Instead, I was blamed. She told me that I had been tempting him, that I shouldn't have acted the way I did. That night, I reached out to my half-brother Sam. He was the only one who ever made me feel safe, the only person who had always tried to protect me. Sam and his wife, Sandy, immediately stepped in. Sam confronted my mother, but she didn't care. She told him to take me if he wanted to, as long as he never asked her for money. And that's exactly what he did. Sam and Sandy became my legal guardians, and they took me in, giving me a place to live, a home, and a sense of safety that I had never had before. But even as I moved in with Sam, things didn't stop. The bullying continued, but now it was more insidious. It wasn't just physical anymore, it was psychological warfare. Chris didn't just make my life difficult, he began to tear apart the pieces of my existence that I'd fought so hard to rebuild. And my mother? She didn't care. She never cared. I never expected things to change. Honestly, I was resigned to the idea that my life was just going to be a series of fights for recognition, followed by dismissals. Even after moving in with Sam and Sandy, I didn't feel like I had escaped everything. Sure, I had a safe space now, but I couldn't shake the weight of the past. Chris and my mom, they still haunted me in ways I didn't even realize. For a long time, I wasn't really sure if I'd ever be able to live a normal life. The scars, both emotional and physical, stayed with me. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface. The nightmares, the panic attacks, the flashbacks to the times Chris would make me feel like nothing more than an inconvenience in my own home. Even at Sam's, I still had moments where I'd hear a knock at the door and my heart would drop, wondering if it was someone from my past coming to drag me back into that hell. But slowly, I began to heal. The first step was knowing that I had people who cared about me, who protected me without question. Sam, Sandy, and their kids, they made me feel like I could breathe again. I had a chance to finish my education, go to college, and live without the constant fear of Chris showing up at my door or my mom undermining me at every turn. For once, I had a chance to make something of myself. I finished high school with the support of Sam's family. They made sure I didn't have to worry about tuition, housing, or anything else. It wasn't just a financial gift, it was a lifeline. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't alone, like I wasn't a burden. Sam and Sandy treated me like I was their own daughter, never making me feel guilty for staying with them. And in return, I worked hard. I finished my bachelor's, went on to get my master's, and soon found myself with a job that I was proud of. I had my life together, finally. But then came the message from my mother. It was completely unexpected. I hadn't heard from her in years, not since I turned 18. She had made it clear back then that she didn't want anything to do with me. But now, at 29, she suddenly decided she missed me and wanted to reconnect. The message was sugary sweet, full of fake affection and questions about my life. How was I doing? What had I been up to? It was almost like nothing had happened between us, like the years of pain and neglect had never existed. I'm not going to lie, I was hesitant. My instincts screamed at me to ignore her, but part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had changed. I replied politely, telling her I was doing well, and I briefly mentioned my work as a nurse practitioner, but I didn't give her any details. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of knowing how much I'd achieved without her. Her response surprised me. She asked about my salary. I didn't answer her directly. I just said it was enough to pay my bills. But that wasn't enough for her. She wanted more. She then launched into a detailed description of how Chris was struggling financially. Apparently, he was deep in student debt and couldn't make ends meet. She told me that, as family, I needed to help him out. That's when it hit me. Nothing had changed. Not really. It was all a manipulation tactic, trying to get me to feel guilty for not supporting the person who had tormented me for years. I was supposed to forgive and forget, to ignore the years of abuse, just because Chris was in a tough spot. And of course, my mom tried to guilt trip me into believing that I owed them, that I had to repay them for raising me. I was furious. I couldn't believe the audacity of her. I shut my phone off and decided I wouldn't engage. It wasn't my responsibility to bail out Chris. I wasn't his carer, and I didn't owe him anything. But of course, it didn't end there. The messages and calls started pouring in, first from my mom, then from Chris himself, and eventually from a few other relatives, all demanding the same thing. That's when I turned to Sam. Sam, who had always been my protector, my rock, and my family, knew exactly what I was going through. When I told him about the messages, his anger was immediate and intense. He was furious that my mother would do this, especially after everything that had happened. He told me to block them all, every single one of them. He didn't want me to have to deal with their manipulation anymore, but I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. I decided to take a couple of days off work to deal with this. I called my boss and explained the situation. She was incredibly understanding, offering me the time off I needed to focus on what was happening. I didn't know what was coming next, but I could already feel the weight of it all. The next day, my mom and Chris showed up at Sam's house. I wasn't prepared for that. I was alone and Sam and Sandy were at work. I immediately called Sam and he told me not to open the door. I knew that was the right thing to do, but the fear and panic that rushed through me were almost overwhelming. What would they do if they got inside? What if they forced their way in? I stayed put, trying to keep calm, but I could hear Chris outside, trying to find a way in. He was yelling, banging on the door, calling me every name in the book. My mom was screaming too, saying that I owed them for everything, that I had to help Chris. The words they were throwing at me were all so familiar. Just another round of manipulation, another round of guilt tripping. When Sam arrived, I saw him drag them off the porch, practically kicking them out. It wasn't just the physical threat they posed, it was the emotional toll they'd taken on me. But Sam and Sandy were there, and they made sure I was safe. At that moment, I knew it was time to make a choice. I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't keep letting them manipulate me. I needed to set boundaries, not just for me, but for my peace of mind. I needed to stop them from coming into my life and causing chaos whenever they felt like it. And so, the legal fight began. But more than that, I began to see the importance of protecting myself, not just from them, but from the guilt and emotional weight they had tried to place on me for years. It had been a few days since that chaotic encounter with my mom and Chris, but the sense of unease hadn't left me. The worst part? They weren't done. They weren't backing off just because Sam had stepped in and made them leave. It felt like they thought they could just show up whenever they wanted and get what they wanted. The idea that my own mother and stepbrother could be so entitled, so dismissive of everything I'd been through, kept me up at night. I was tired, I was angry, and I couldn't let them continue to make me feel like I owed them anything. Sam and I began to take the necessary steps toward taking legal action. First, I spoke to a lawyer. My biggest concern was my mom's constant harassment, but it also turned out that the situation was more complicated than I thought. My mother had been using my social security number for things I hadn't authorized, and worse, she'd been drawing from my father's trust fund, claiming it was for my benefit when it was clear she had no right to it. The trust was supposed to be a way for me to have financial security, especially considering how my mom had squandered everything she could ever get her hands on. I didn't even know about the trust until I turned 18, and by that point, most of it had already been drained. My stepbrother, Chris, had benefited the most. The more I dug, the more I realized that my mom had been using my name and identity to manipulate situations to her advantage. She wanted me to pay for her mistakes and for Chris's debts, something I refused to do. Sam was livid when he found out what my mother had been doing. He was protective of me, and rightfully so. We began working together to find out more details so we could take action. I had no choice but to freeze my credit, change my bank accounts, and make sure my personal information was secure. I couldn't trust my mother to stop, and I had to take drastic measures. The harassment didn't stop, though. It only escalated. It wasn't just phone calls or texts anymore. She was spreading lies about me to anyone who would listen. My mom was using her side of the family, people I didn't even know existed, to attack my character. She accused me of being a burden and a bad daughter. The lies were absurd. She told anyone who would listen that I was greedy and ungrateful, trying to ruin her family. That was a new low. It didn't matter that I had worked hard to get to where I was. It didn't matter that I'd been forced to grow up without protection or love from the person who should have been there for me. All she cared about was manipulating me and making me feel worthless. And then came the post on social media. I had never felt so exposed in my life. My mother shared a post where she called me a temptress and accused me of attempting to ruin Chris's life. She claimed that I had been the one to initiate everything, that I had somehow enticed Chris. She made it sound like it was all my fault. It was too much to handle. It wasn't just lies anymore. It was a full-blown attack on my character, and it was happening in public. People I didn't even know were commenting, taking sides, and tearing me down. I didn't respond at first. I couldn't bring myself to get involved in the madness. But it was like a virus. It spread. Every time I thought I could escape, there was another message, another accusation. The situation got even worse when my stepfather, who I thought was on my side, turned out to be part of the problem. He was keeping quiet, staying out of it, and letting my mother manipulate him as well. I couldn't handle it anymore. I needed to protect myself, and I had to do something about it. Sam suggested that we go for a restraining order. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but it was the only way I could feel safe. At least then, there would be a legal barrier between me and the people who had caused me so much pain. We filed the papers, and that's when things really got messy. My mother didn't take it well. Of course, she didn't. The legal proceedings triggered a new wave of harassment. She started accusing me of taking things too far, of destroying the family. She couldn't see that she had been the one destroying everything all along. I was done trying to explain myself. I couldn't keep being dragged into her web of lies. I knew what I had to do. As the weeks passed, I had to take a step back from everything. I spent less and less time on social media, avoiding the endless messages and posts. I had to focus on my own mental health and find a way to rebuild myself after all the years of emotional turmoil. It was hard, especially because I'd never really been able to just be without worrying about what my mom or Chris might do next. But being at Sam's house, having his support, gave me the space to think clearly. And then one evening, it all came crashing down again. My mother showed up at my workplace. It was a Saturday evening, and I had planned to get some paperwork done at the clinic. My boss, who knew about the situation, was supportive. I had been working from home, doing mostly administrative tasks, and the peaceful routine had become a sanctuary for me. But that day, my mom walked into the clinic under a fake name. I noticed it immediately. The second I saw her, my heart sank. She was there to cause a scene again. She had to know what she was doing, especially when she saw that I was working. She had no right to show up like that, but I couldn't just ignore her. The confrontation wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. My boss had to step in. She asked my mother to leave, which of course didn't go well. My mom refused, throwing a letter at my boss and demanding to speak with me. The whole situation was humiliating, and my anxiety reached a new level. I didn't have to face her alone, though. My boss was firm, and with the help of the clinic's security, we finally made sure my mother left. She threw a fit, creating a scene in front of everyone, and as soon as she left, I felt like I could finally breathe again. But the damage had been done. When I opened the letter, I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was her usual manipulation, but this time, it was even worse. She begged me to give Chris a chance, and even suggested that I should marry him and have his child. That was the final straw. The letter was filled with all the same lies, the same excuses for Chris's actions, and the same twisted demands. That moment, reading that letter, was the moment I realized I was done with it all. No more running from my past. No more being afraid of them. It was time for me to take control of my life once and for all. I couldn't let them continue to destroy me. The moment I read my mother's letter, a wave of clarity hit me like a tidal wave. I realized that everything I had been trying to avoid, everything I had been running from, had all led to this point. I had spent so many years trying to appease my mother, trying to navigate through the chaos of my childhood and adolescence, all the while hoping that one day she would realize how wrong she had been. But the truth was, she wasn't going to change. She was never going to acknowledge the years of pain she caused. And worse, she was willing to perpetuate it. The letter was her final attempt at manipulation, and in that moment, I decided that I wouldn't let her win anymore. I had spent far too long trying to fit into a family that had never cared for me in the way a family should. I wasn't going to be part of her toxic cycle anymore. Sam and I immediately started working on the legal aspects of the situation. We knew we needed to make sure that I had solid documentation and support for the case we were building. The harassment wasn't just emotional anymore, it was illegal. My mother had been using my identity for her own financial gain, draining what little was left of my father's inheritance, and now she was trying to get me to pay for Chris's student debt. She wanted me to sacrifice my hard-earned money for someone who had tormented me for years. It was the last straw. I was done. I was no longer the quiet, passive daughter who let things slide. I was ready to take control of my own life. Sam had been a rock for me throughout all of this. He had always been there, even when our paths diverged, and he was determined to protect me. He wasn't going to let my mom or Chris get away with this. We worked with a lawyer to file for a restraining order. The goal wasn't just to protect me physically, but to establish legal boundaries. My mother had crossed too many lines, and it was time to make sure she couldn't continue to invade my life. But no matter how many steps forward I took, there was always some new setback. The legal process was long and draining. Every day felt like I was treading water, and it was exhausting. Sam was constantly reassuring me that we would get through it, but there were days when I didn't know how much more I could take. The legal battle wasn't the only thing I had to deal with. After the incident at the clinic, I knew that things with my mother had taken a serious turn. She had shown up at my workplace under a fake name, creating a scene and causing unnecessary distress. I couldn't believe she would do something like that, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. She had always been willing to do anything to get what she wanted, even if it meant humiliating me in front of people who had no idea what was really going on. It was during this period of overwhelming pressure that I decided to take some time for myself. Sam had suggested a weekend getaway. He could tell I was burning out, and he insisted that I needed to step away from the drama, even just for a few days. It was something I had never really done before, taking a break without feeling guilty about it. But I realized that if I didn't give myself the space to heal, I would just keep spiraling into the same toxic cycle. Sophie, one of my closest friends, joined me on the trip. We spent the weekend hiking in the mountains, taking in the peaceful quiet that I desperately needed. The serenity of nature, the simplicity of it all, was exactly what I had been craving. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of everything constantly pressing down on me. During our trip, I thought a lot about how far I had come. A few years ago, I wouldn't have had the strength to stand up to my mother, let alone cut ties with her. I had spent so many years feeling like I wasn't good enough, like I needed her approval to survive. But I was done chasing after that approval. I had finally realized that I didn't need her to define me. After returning from the trip, things started to take a different turn. I had finally gathered the courage to speak to my lawyer about taking legal action against my mother and Chris for the harassment and for the fraudulent use of my personal information. This wasn't just about getting justice for myself. It was about breaking free from their control once and for all. I had learned over the years that it wasn't enough to just let it go. Sometimes you have to fight back. You have to stand up for yourself, even if it feels like the hardest thing in the world. I knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but I wasn't alone. Sam was by my side, and so were the few people in my life who had always been there for me. This wasn't just my fight. It was our fight, and I was determined to win. But as the days passed, the pressure continued to mount. My mother had been relentless. The messages, the phone calls, the lies she spread about me, it never seemed to stop. She was using every tool at her disposal to try and make me feel small again. But I wasn't going to let her. I couldn't. One day, I received a message from my mom. She had posted something on social media about me once again, accusing me of being the one to destroy our family. It was the same rhetoric she had always used. She was trying to make herself out to be the victim while painting me as the villain. I couldn't let it slide anymore. I had enough. I sent her a message back, not full of anger, but full of clarity. I told her that I had moved on and that I would no longer tolerate her abuse. I informed her that I was taking legal action and that I would never again be part of her toxic narrative. It felt empowering to finally say the words that had been trapped inside me for so long. I was done pretending to be something I wasn't, for her or for anyone. In that moment, I knew I was taking the first real step toward true freedom. I was no longer bound by the chains of my past. I was finally free to live my life on my terms. And I had Sam, my real family, and my own resilience to thank for that. Things were quiet for a while after the decision was made. I had made it clear to my mother, to Chris, and to anyone else who still believed their lies that I was done. But quiet doesn't always mean peace. The harassment, though less frequent, still found ways to creep into my life. My mother continued her campaign online, twisting the truth in every direction. It was painful, but in a way, I had expected it. She had always been good at painting herself as the victim, and me as the villain. Despite everything, there was a part of me that still hoped for some kind of apology, some acknowledgement that what had happened to me wasn't my fault. But I knew deep down that wasn't coming. Not from her, and certainly not from Chris. It was time to stop holding my breath. Sam and I continued to work with our lawyer, preparing for the legal battle. It wasn't just about getting my inheritance back, though that was a huge part of it. It was about getting justice for the years of manipulation, the years I had spent in that toxic environment, trying to please a mother who would never truly see me. I was doing this for myself, For the girl who had spent too long trying to be someone she wasn't to make her family happy. The days blended together. Paperwork, phone calls, and more waiting. But during that time, I found myself rediscovering parts of myself I had forgotten. I started focusing on the things I loved, the things that had once given me joy before the weight of my past had clouded everything. I took up painting again. I started reading more, diving into books that had nothing to do with legal battles or family drama. It felt like I was slowly but surely piecing myself back together. And then came the call. It was unexpected, yet I knew it was inevitable. My lawyer had news. Important news. The case was moving forward. We had enough evidence to make a solid case against my mother and Chris, and it looked like the court was going to hear us. I sat down with Sam that night, and we talked about everything. The past, the present, the future. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I talked about the steps ahead, finally seeing the end of this long, painful chapter. Sam reminded me, as always, that no matter what, I wasn't alone in this. He and Sandy had been my constant support, and I owed it to myself to finish what I had started. It was a strange feeling, though. A part of me still carried that fear, the fear of what would happen if things didn't go the way I hoped. But I couldn't keep living in fear. Not anymore. I had to be brave, not just for the girl I used to be, but for the woman I was becoming. The case was set, and now it was time to prepare. I couldn't help but wonder how my mother and Chris would react. Would they try to twist the narrative even further? Would they back down in the face of legal consequences? I didn't know. But what I did know was that I wasn't going to let them control my life anymore. This was my time to take back what was mine, to reclaim my life, my future, and my peace. So I waited. But this time, it wasn't filled with dread. This time, it was filled with anticipation. I was ready to face whatever came next. The road ahead was long, but I was stronger now, and I wasn't backing down. The weeks leading up to the court date were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and anxious waiting. Every time I sat down with my lawyer, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me again. But this time, it wasn't as suffocating. I was no longer the scared, silent girl who had let herself be manipulated by my mother. I was an adult, someone who had a career, a support system, and the strength to stand up for herself. Sam and Sandy had been my rock through all of this. Their support gave me the courage to face each new challenge with determination. Even when things felt like they were spiraling, I had them by my side. It was hard to imagine how I had survived for so many years without this kind of love and care. I was finally learning to accept it, to let myself feel worthy of it. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I felt strangely calm. I had prepared myself for the worst, but I was no longer afraid of it. I wasn't afraid of my mother's lies or Chris's manipulation. This was my chance to take back my life, to set boundaries that couldn't be crossed anymore. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew it was necessary. When we arrived at the courthouse, the air felt thick with tension. The room was filled with familiar faces, my lawyer, Sam, Sandy, and even my stepdad, who had agreed to testify on my behalf. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. It was complicated, but I knew I had to take every bit of support I could get. Then my mother and Chris walked in. They were sitting together, talking quietly, and I couldn't help but notice the smug look on Chris's face. It made my stomach turn. He thought this was just another game, another chance to manipulate me into submission. But I wasn't going to play along anymore. The hearing started, and it was exactly as I expected. My mother tried to twist everything, painting herself as the victim, claiming that I had misunderstood everything and that I was just bitter about being left out of the family. Chris, of course, followed her lead, adding in his own lies and exaggerations. It was frustrating to hear, but I was prepared. I let their words wash over me, focusing instead on my own testimony. When it was my turn to speak, I took a deep breath and began. I told the court everything: the bullying, the manipulation, the harassment. I spoke about the years I had spent trying to please a mother who would never accept me for who I was. I spoke about the fear, the shame, and the guilt that had been planted in me since I was a child, all because I was a girl and not the son she wanted. And most importantly, I spoke about the abuse I had suffered at Chris's hands, the pain and humiliation that had been brushed off as nothing. As I spoke, I could feel the weight of the truth lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't easy to relive those moments, but it was necessary. This was the only way to move forward. I wasn't the only one who had been hurt, but I was the one who had to stand up. And for once, I was doing it on my terms. The judge listened carefully, and I could see the skepticism in my mother's eyes as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Her lies weren't holding up. She could no longer twist the truth in her favor. I didn't know what the final outcome would be, but I knew that I had done everything I could to protect myself and my future. When the hearing was over, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Sam squeezed my hand, and I could see the pride in his eyes. It was over for now, but the real battle was still ahead. There would be more legal challenges, more hurdles to overcome, but I wasn't afraid anymore. That night, I sat down with Sam and Sandy, the three of us talking about what had happened. I realized that, for the first time in my life, I was truly free. Free from the control my mother had over me, free from the weight of her expectations. I had a future now, one I could build on my own terms. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about everything I had been through, the pain, the struggle, the fear, but I also thought about the strength I had gained, the person I had become. I was no longer the victim in this story. I was the hero of my own life, and I was finally taking back the control I had lost so many years ago. Tomorrow, I would wake up and continue building my life, piece by piece. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful.